we wanted to follow up on one of our topics that we started last week, considering developing a strategic plan and a culture of innovation. I found that topic to be extremely useful, and unfortunately, due to poor audio recording on the pre-recorded session, we could not really get a good grasp of the knowledge. So this week, I'm happy to have my distinguished guest, Chester Wojcinski from CSW, to join me and help us to really understand the topic that it is really dear to a lot of mantra that we live in this cultural diversity that we work along with different partners around different parts of the world. And at the same time, how a strategic plan and the culture of innovation can help. Without that, giving you some background, which I had mentioned in the previous broadcast, Chet is a leadership and organizational cultural specializing in development capabilities to strengthen performance in universities, hospitals, Fortune 500 companies, and SME. Chet provides management consulting services in strategic planning, organizational design, executive assessment, and coaching. In fact, we may have a project for you, Chet, that you're going to be helping us out in some of the things that we're going to be doing in Southeast Asia. And his previous position includes Senior Advisor of Carnegie Mellon University, Executive Director of Organizational Development at Georgia Institute of Technology, and Adjunct Professor of School of Public Policy, Director of Organizational Development, and lecturer in School and Industrial of Labor Relation at Cornell University. Director of Corporate Planning, Training, and New Venture Development for a subsidiary of Dow Jones, and Director of Foundation of Training for St. Joseph Hospital in London, Ontario, and Mercy Hospital in Miami. By the way, I lectured at Mercy once upon a time. He completed his graduate and undergraduate in sociology in Southern Illinois University and the University of Western Ontario, and postgraduate doctoral studies in education and social science in the University of Toronto. Without further ado, I'd like to turn over the topic to Chet. Chet, podium is yours.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm delighted for this opportunity to speak with you today about an important topic, and I'd like to thank Dr. Murati and NETSTAIRS for this opportunity. One of the biggest challenges facing organizations, and all kinds of organizations, as well as society today, is how to tap into the knowledge, the experience, and the energy of people. Research shows that almost 3/4 of major change efforts fail to accomplish their objectives. And one of the reasons they fail to accomplish their objectives is that they fail to engage stakeholders in a process of dialogue and collaboration to be able to develop a plan and to move forward and to actually implement that plan. What social physics, which is an emerging topic again today, suggests is that, most organizations are in a state of entropy, and society is in a state of entropy where people are moving apart from each other. And we see this happening in politics, we see this happening in higher education, we see this happening in the business world. How do we get people to come together and work together? There are many differences amongst people in terms of cultures, backgrounds, disciplinary differences, ages and genders and so on. And we all seem to latch on to these identities because they give us a sense of stability. But in doing so, we actually push away from other people. And so one of the challenges in making organizations successful and being able to implement a strategic plan and culture is to really bring these people together and to really get them to create meaning together and coordinate their behavior. So the purpose of this presentation is to look at how we can do that in terms of developing a strategic plan. A strategic plan is a foundation on which an organization it bases its action and tries to create or design its future. And so how do we create that strategic plan? But then as important as the strategic plan is, we have to be able to establish a culture of expectations in which people are on the same page in terms of how to accomplish that strategic plan. So if we don't reshape or modify the culture to the plan, or we don't redesign the organization structure to the plan is pretty much doomed to fail in terms of accomplishing its objectives. So what this case study that we're going to look at today is based on the work that I did at the Georgia Institute of Technology a few years back, in which we developed a strategic plan and created a culture of innovation. So the purpose of this, the objectives that we're going to try to accomplish today is to really get into how do we develop this strategic plan, engaging all the stakeholders and using what we call converging methods of social inquiry. And then how do we, once we've created that plan, how do we create a culture of innovation, a set of expectations, norms, and practices that support that plan for increasing organizational performance and sustainability. The current realities, I mentioned that the difficulties of people moving apart and the identity-based knowledge that we see today, where people are competing rather than collaborating. In addition to that, we see competition, from our from all other sectors of society in terms of who has the knowledge and what knowledge is correct and what knowledge is incorrect, and we go on debating fruitlessly in many cases that we're right and everybody else is wrong. In the business world, we're competing against a set of competitors who are really where there's a finite amount of business in the environment and a finite amount of capital, and we're trying to gain our share of that capital. So the competition is really also a part of the entropy and pushing us apart. We're seeing a lot of new emerging technologies, which are very disruptive, as many people note. Rising costs of doing business, limited resources. We're not tapping into the talent, and consequently, we have a lot of unrealized potential. So these are some of the environmental factors that we're up against, and we're trying to develop and implement a strategic plan or initiate indeed any major change project. The challenges and the opportunities that exist within this environment, because we could always look at some of these factors as current realities as challenges and opportunities, are how do we create new value for our customers and stakeholders? And to create new value for customers and stakeholders, how do we engage them in communication and dialogue? How do we develop clear strategies and set expectations? How do we learn together and get on the same page so that we can coordinate our behavior? How do we develop the social capital we need to be able to implement our new ideas and our innovations? How do we streamline our operations to reduce costs? And all of this boils down to how can we become, better, in terms of our performance and better in terms of introducing new innovations. So this is kind of the context for strategic planning, looking at the environment, what's happening in the environment, the external environment, and then looking internally at some of the challenges and opportunities we're facing, and then being able to develop a strategic plan to sort it all out, to create some kind of organization that we can follow as we move forward. And a strategic plan is simply an information and value-based decision-making process, in which we're really looking at our customers and our stakeholders and their expectations, their interests and needs, and we're looking at what has to be done in order to satisfy those interests and needs, what resources do we need, and what do we want to accomplish in terms of our vision. The vision word is used frequently in strategic planning because it gives us a target to aim for as we move forward. And we'll talk more about how we translate that vision into action. So the strategic planning process that we used at Georgia Tech was first to organize some planning groups, and we wanted to include as many stakeholders as possible in this process. And so we had an executive group which included senior leaders. We had a steering committee, which a cross-section of people from across the organization. We had a number of subcommittees that were focused on specific topical areas. And we had what we call core contributors, and we'll talk a little bit more about those. But the core contributors were people from across the organization who held leadership positions or who were central to the different networks within the organization. So given those different groups and organizing those different groups, the next challenge is and our step in the process is to conduct an assessment of the internal and external environment, to engage those stakeholders in conducting that assessment, and identifying strategic opportunities and capabilities, developing what we call a grounded theory of action. And a grounded theory of action is a theory that we've all contributed to creating, that we feel represents the current situation, and we buy into that situation and determine what kind of actions we need to take. Then we enact and diffuse those actions across the organization, and indeed even across the entire ecosystem, and we embed them in the culture of the organization. In other words, they become institutionalized as common norms, practices, and values. Right. So that's the process. I mentioned the organization. At Georgia Tech, we had a president who had gone through many strategic planning processes and was very seasoned in strategic planning, and helped to really identify the right people that we should bring and have at the table in terms of the strategic planning process. So he formed the steering committee, or identified the people who would be on the steering committee. He brought his senior people in as part of the executive committee. We identified key people who were central in the organization to head strategic planning subcommittees. We had a support group, which was the group that I was responsible for, the Office of Organizational Development. And we had the core contributors, but we also went outside the organization to board members, advisors, advisory committees, industry experts, and people, other leaders within the ecosystem, to really have all the stakeholders, to try to bring the whole system, into the process as much as possible. Following the organization, we had a structure for the strategic plan itself. One, we wanted to review and revise our mission, our purpose or reason for existence. We wanted to identify our core values. What are the beliefs, the norms, and the practices that will help us to accomplish that mission? What is our vision, our aspirations for the future? To have a very explicit vision, and to articulate that vision as a way of pulling people into the process. To have a set of goals, short and long-term targets, and then to have a set of strategies or proposed actions for achieving those goals. So these components are familiar to anybody who's been through a strategic planning process. And but the key here is not just to you look at those components as tasks, but to look at them as part of an integrated process in which everybody is involved. And so the strategic planning process, what's unique about the strategic planning process is that it engages everyone in social inquiry. It engages everybody in research and in a learning process. And it engages them to collect data. So we're sending out people to do interviews. We're having people do focus groups. People are operating essentially on their own to interview and to engage other stakeholders in the process to find out what they think about the current situation and what they think needs to be done. We gather that information, we analyze and interpret that data, and create meaning around it. And then we construct this grounded theory of action, as I mentioned, and we go through the next steps of actually then enacting, diffusing it, and embedding it in the culture. And we'll talk about the specific tasks associated and activities associated with each one of those functions. But the research is really the key, and typically what we call action research, which is engaging people in collecting data, analyzing it, interpreting it, and acting upon it. So we are focused on 4 different research methods for collecting, analyzing, interpreting data. One of the methods was what we call appreciative inquiry. Appreciative inquiry is simply to look at what we value most and what are the peak experiences that people have had in the organization, what has happened in the past, that has really helped the organization to be successful. So we try to identify the core strengths and the assets of the organization. Taking that data, then we apply what we call a semiotic method. Now, semiosis is simply a meaning-making process. And how do we create meaning around that data? Well, one of the ways in which we create meaning is to analyze the data, to actually look at the language that's being used, the words that are being used, and to, I'll talk more about this later, but to create meaning within the group, common meaning around using the language that we identified in the research process. The third step then is to develop or evaluate. We use what we call fourth generation evaluation, which is we evaluate consistently throughout the strategic planning process and provide feedback on all the stages within that process. We really need to be able to not just create meaning, but we need to be able to find out whether that meaning translates across the organization. In other words, where other people, is that meaningful to other people? And then we look at the organization and the networks within the organization and the networks within the ecosystem. And we apply an actor network method. An actor network method is simply looking at the human as well as the non-human entities within the networks that actually bring about the change. And we'll talk more about that, but what Actor Network does is identify and leverage critical roles and engage people in critical roles and engage their networks in critical roles. So those four methods of social inquiry draw from the humanities, the sciences, and the social sciences. So this is a highly interdisciplinary process, which is, and creating interdisciplinary theory is one of the challenges in research today and innovation today. Because what we find is that the most innovative organizations are the ones that are most interdisciplinary. They approach things, they look at society, they look at their organization, they look at the environment through multiple lenses. Not just looking at it from a scientific standpoint, but looking at it from a meaningful standpoint, as well as a social science standpoint in terms of the networks and society and the values in society that are going to help drive that process. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about each of these methods of inquiry because they are core to the development of the strategic plan and the implementation of the plan itself, as well as the creation of the culture and the reshaping of the culture. So in appreciative inquiry, we're engaging stakeholders in creating a baseline of strengths and assets. What do we have that we've been successful in the past? How have we been successful in the past? What have we done? What experiences do we have? What are the key attributes or factors that drive experience? And so you're asking people a set of questions and drawing out these strengths and these assets. You know, what have been the high points for you in your work in this organization? What things do you value most about yourself, about the work you're doing, about the organization? What are the core factors that give life to the organization? How do we introduce or heighten our vitality and health? And so we're trying to get data that, and getting data, we're looking at the actual words that are being used. We're not trying to group the data to create concepts, but we're looking at the actual data itself in words, and we're going to let the stakeholders group and create and categorize the concepts. And this is quite different from the way research is done in most organizations where experts do it. And so we're going to look at the discrete data, and we're going to distribute that discrete data to all of the stakeholders. You know, what are people saying? You know, are they happy about being here? Are they generating important experiences? Are they learning? Do they feel the organization has important strengths that we can leverage? Or are they feeling that, you know, I have never experienced anything enriching here since I started? So when we ask for data, we're going to get people to tell us what they think, and what they think is going to help us identify strengths. But they're also going to tell us about some of the limitations and some of the problems that we have.
Right.
The point of appreciative inquiry is to focus on the strengths. So going to the second method, we're analyzing that data. We're looking at the words, the signifiers that people are using in relation to specific objects. An object is innovation. An object is to increase performance. What are the words that people are using around those particular objects? And we're breaking those signifiers down into effects. What are the effects that we see what are they saying in terms of the effects that they want to see within the organization? And then we back out of effects and look at the other signifiers and get the group to look at what are the causes. And so from using this triadic model, which was initially developed by Charles Sanders Peirce, the father of American pragmatism, we're able to identify causes and effects and create if-then propositions or hypotheses. If we communicate more effectively, if we can engage all our stakeholders in the process of communication, we can understand the situation more fully, and if we understand the situation more fully, we can identify the effects we would like to bring about, and we can identify the causes behind those effects. And so through this method of semiotics, we're actually creating hypotheses and theories from the data. This is summary of the real data that came out of one of the exercises where people were saying, we want to collaborate, and we're not collaborating. We're in a state of entropy, moving apart. We would like to see more professional development. We would like to have more communication. We would like to see more consistency. We would like to be able to create knowledge and to create economic value. So those are effects, and from those effects, we can then develop this grounded theory of action. And as I said before, a grounded theory of action is just a set, it's a rationale that we all agree on, that we co-create, and we all agree on. And based on this view of reality, we infer actions that we can take, or we derive actions that we can take to achieve that the reality that we're striving for. So there are four really different types of inferencing that take place during this process of developing a grounded theory. We formulate hypotheses through abduction, which is simply guessing, or through our intuition, induction, collecting data, looking at the implications of the data, what we call retroduction. We all have different models and theories within from our experience that we use to interpret reality. So we're trying to use that information in developing this grounded theory, and then we use deduction to derive the strategies and actions, and then move out of the narrative, out of the words, and to create representative images and narratives to represent that grounded theory of action. So an example is useful. And at Georgia Tech, we used the book Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. And that's the book itself is a grounded theory of action, because what Gladwell did was he went out and interviewed and talked to a lot of people and pulled together the information and used the semiotic process to say, okay, what do outliers? And outliers are people that are above and beyond the norm. They're not just falling within the normative range, but they're exceptional. What do the exceptional organizations and people, how do they get to be exceptional? And the three factors that he found based on his analysis of the data was one, circumstance. We're all facing different circumstances, and so we have to be able to respond to these circumstances. Sometimes circumstances are favorable, sometimes they're not favorable. We have to understand the difference, and we have to be able to manage that difference. But competency, outliers have competency, they have the attributes, they have the skills, they have the knowledge in order to address those circumstances, and they have a culture. They have a set of expectations which provides a consistency of meaning and practice to be able to implement the competencies to respond to the circumstances, to become an outlier. So this is a grounded theory of action. And this book resonated with the faculty and the staff at Georgia Tech. because they wanted to see Georgia Tech as an outlier, and many people already did see Georgia Tech as an outlier. And so how can we manage the circumstances, the competency, and the culture to remain or to strengthen our position as an outlier? So the third method, is once you've created that meaning, as Gladwell did, you use the scientific method to validate it. And I mentioned that fourth generation evaluation is a key part of this process. So you're doing more research, you're identifying your models, your hypotheses, you're looking at creating that grounded theory of action, you're making predictions, you're testing those predictions through experiments, through simulations, you're evaluating the findings, you're revising your model based upon those findings, and then you're enacting and communicating the process. So what science does is it really digs into the model, and it tries to validate that particular model. And in this process, you're learning more, you're building in more connections with other stakeholders, you're enlarging and strengthening your network. So the application of the scientific method uses what we call mixed methods. That's both qualitative and quantitative methods. And experts are not doing this. Everybody's doing this. All the stakeholders are involved in this process. And so one of the things that we used to really involve our stakeholders, engage our stakeholders, was a number of retreats and workshops. So you're through half-day to full-day workshops across the entire institution, you're involving your stakeholders in creating this grounded theory. And first collecting data, then creating this grounded theory using this action research process, and then evaluating the results, getting feedback on the results, and communicating the grounded theory and the results. So all of the stakeholders are acting as translators of the grounded theory, enacting it and diffusing it and evaluating it on an ongoing basis. And this is where we move into the fourth method of actor network theory, which is looking at the networks in the organization, and the people are part of those networks. They're a key part of the networks, but there are also other things that are part of the network that are critical for success, including resources, including technologies, including finances, including facilities, including equipment, so artifacts even. So all of these things comprise the network. And what we're trying to do is look at the network in a broad sense and to construct common definitions and meanings, and to establish relationships and connections between resources, between people, resources, facilities, and technologies, and create a set of allies who are going to enact and grow and strengthen that network. So actor network theory, which is pretty prominent today as a theoretical approach to bringing about change, simply involves mapping the network. Who are the right people to bring on the bus, as Jim Collins would say? What are the things we need to make sure that we have on the bus? How do we engage them in collaboration and dialogue? How do we assign specific roles where they can translate and get data and engage and bring in new allies? And how do we involve them in embedding the grounded theory of action in the social structure, the organization, culture, and the ecosystem? And action research is the overarching framework for doing that. It involves data collection, appreciative inquiry, data analysis, semiotics, creating meaning, constructing the grounded theory of action, where we've all contributed to the co-development of what the environment looks like, what the organization looks like, and what we have to do together to make a difference and to derive that action plan, enact it, and embed it in the culture. That grounded theory of action, and that's action research and grounded theory of action. I just want to spend a few minutes to talk about how we do that. And the process is driven by questions. The research process is driven by questions. One of the things we're doing is we're formulating a set of questions and testing those questions with our stakeholders. Some of the questions we use in this process of doing action research, which is sometimes called the future search, is what are or should be the contributions of the organization to its stakeholders. So when you're looking at a range of stakeholders, you're looking at what are the contributions to employees, what are the contributions to the customers, what are the contributions to the community, what are the contributions to the industry, and so on. What are the, or should be the core values in pursuing these contributions? What are the beliefs that are central to being successful in delivering those contributions? What are the organization's greatest strengths and assets? What would you say are the best possible opportunities for improvement and innovation in the organization? So we're defining and creating meaning around opportunities and creating meaning around what we really need to innovate. Based on our strengths and these opportunities, what should we aspire to in the next 25 years? That was an interesting point of the Georgia Tech plan. It was a 25-year plan. Talk about long-range planning.
One of the things I wanted to add in here, just because of the time constraint, I wanted to invite you perhaps for the remaining of the session to join us next week so we can carry on, because I know you're under time constraint yourself. And as a result of it, if you like, we can carry on, or if you like, we can schedule the next one so we can carry the next part of the lecture as part 2.
What would you prefer?
I would prefer, because of your time constraint, we cut it down and we schedule for next week, same time. We carry on part 2. So our colleagues that they have listened to this section, they can carry on with the next week.
Okay. And this is a good breaking point.
Great. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Chet, for presenting the presentation. It's extremely informative. Thank you, Maddie, for being with us. And we all see you next week. Have a great weekend and enjoy your week, and we'll join you next week.
Thank you for your attention.